Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. We are all hoping to finally get a budget-friendly viable graphics card to be able to revive old gaming computers and keep them alive for a few more years, or just build a budget-friendly gaming setup from scratch. Many had hopes that Intel Arc B580 would be such a viable alternative. When the graphics card was released, it was very positively reviewed. For example, Hardware Unboxed found that B580 beat AMD RX 6700 XT and almost reaching NVIDIA RTX 3060 Ti level of performance. But unlike 3060 Ti that comes with insulting 8 gigs of video memory and is still overpriced, Arc B580 was available in stores for reasonable price and came with 12 GB of video memory. Unfortunately, soon after that it was discovered that the B580 heavily underperforms when it is paired with a budget-friendly gaming CPU. Following Hardware Unboxed test results, when they retested B580 with the Ryzen 5 5600, they found out that in this configuration B580 is barely enough to beat AMD RX 6650 XT, not to mention RX 6700 XT or RTX 3060 Ti. So in this video I'm going to pair a Intel Arc B580 with an old Xeon E5-2697 V3 on a Chinese motherboard, and of course Turbo Boost Unlock was applied. To have some sort of a reference or comparison point, I'm also going to do all the tests with AMD RX 7600 XT. Yes, these are not one-to-one competitors because 7600 XT costs a bit more and it also has 16 gigs of video memory, but it is a good reference point. Before I go into the test results, it's important to mention that Arc B580, just like any other Intel GPU, requires Resizable Bar to be enabled for optimal performance. These days, most of the Chinese X99 motherboards from AliExpress support Resizable Bar out of the box, but if you have an older motherboard with old BIOS, then you can enable a Resizable Bar with a few simple BIOS modifications. I have a dedicated video tutorial on how to do that. For this video, originally I planned to test 24 games, but Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark would fail with Arc B580 no matter what I have tried. So this will be a 23 game comparison since I excluded Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. If you're here to just see the results and get a quick yes or no answer, then all the results are on your screen. Put the video on pause, check the results and make your own conclusion. On average, B580 loses to RX 7600 XT when paired with E5-2697 V3. In the games I have tested, we get 58-98 FPS against 71-112 FPS with RX 7600 XT. So all in all, Intel Arc B580 gets a much bigger performance hit from a slow gaming CPU than AMD RX 7600 XT. Still, the performance degradation is not too dramatic. If the price is right, then B580 is still a viable alternative to AMD RX 7600 and NVIDIA RTX 4060 that come with 8 GB of video memory only. Now, if you want to see some extra details or you simply enjoy my videos, let's go and compare some games side by side. The first game will be Company of Heroes. It's a strategy game that relies on a single core performance and it doesn't load CPU too much. Here RX 7600 XT wins by a small margin, 5721 against 5214 FPS. It's also worth noting that CPU utilization is always a few percent higher with Arc B580 than with RX 7600 XT. Cyberpunk 2077 is a rather modern AAA title with heavy CPU utilization. RX 7600 XT wins again, but the margin is still not that big, 83-96 FPS against 75-91 FPS. CPU utilization is again a few percent higher with Arc B580. F123, a rather well-optimized racing game that can utilize multiple CPU cores but still lacks a strong single core. Following the trend, RX 7600 XT wins again, and this time with a noticeable margin, 170-109 FPS against 141-185 FPS. CPU utilization is about the same with both of the GPUs, even though B580 renders less frames. About Gears 5 I don't have anything to say, but the game has a built-in benchmark, so I use it in my testing. Here RX 7600 XT is significantly faster than B580, 89-126 FPS against 64-92 FPS. This time CPU utilization with RX 7600 XT is slightly higher than with B580, since RX 7600 XT renders significantly more frames. Still, not a single CPU core is 100% utilized, and the overall CPU usage is about 20%. Thus, I really don't know why B580 performs so poorly in this game. Horizon Zero Dawn is another nightmare for Intel Arc B580. Here, RX 7600 XT renders 82-113 FPS, while B580 delivers miserable 41-57 FPS. This is a rather shocking and unexpected result that I couldn't believe first. I retested the game several times just to find exactly the same numbers. The CPU utilization with B580 is slightly higher than with RX 7600 XT and goes above 50%, even though B580 renders significantly less frames. Returnal is a somehow positive example for Intel Arc B580. It manages to beat AMD RX 7600 XT, at least when comparing average FPS. 7600 XT renders 51-92 FPS, while B580 is good for 4400 FPS. CPU utilization is once again a few percent higher with Intel Arc B580. Monster Hunter Wilds is the newest game in my test suite. Sadly, B580 yet again can't match RX 7600 XT. We get 40-63 FPS with RX 7600 XT and only 26-51 FPS with Intel Arc B580. This time CPU utilization is a few percent higher with the RX 7600 XT as it renders more frames. Why B580 is slower I again cannot explain. GPU load is 99%, CPU load is under 30%, and not a single CPU core is 100% utilized. So yeah, B580 just performs poorly here. Apart of the automated benchmarks, I have also tested several games manually. Here the results will not be as accurate, but it is still interesting to check them. The first one is Counter-Strike 2. Much to my surprise, B580 is not that far behind. 7600 XT renders 78-145 FPS, and B580 is just a bit slower, 62-138 FPS. CPU utilization is hard to compare as it's an online shooter, but in general it's about the same, at around 20-25%. S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 hits CPU and GPU really hard. Here, RX 7600 XT is only able to deliver 27-43 FPS. B580 can't reach even these numbers. It is capable of 21-35 FPS only, and that's a shame. CPU utilization is around 30-50%, and with the B580 it's again a few percent higher. Fortnite I usually test with the game replay, but the replays expire with each update, so I am sick of replaying and retesting the game. This time I'm just testing live, so take these results with a grain of salt. RX 7600 XT delivers 84-176 FPS, which is noticeably faster than B580. It is only capable of 80-144 FPS. It's still an acceptable result, but here B580 heavily underperforms with the Xeon E5-2697 V3, yet again. Valorant is the last game I'm going to cover. Here B580 is yet again slower than RX 7600 XT, but the gap is not that significant. 7600 XT yields 132-263 FPS, while with B580 we get 120-244 FPS. Not an amazing result, but it's still kind of acceptable considering that B580 is more than 50 years cheaper than RX 7600 XT. Finally, let's take a look at the power consumption and efficiency. As always, I measure and report entire system power consumption from the wall, so higher CPU usage with Arc B580 will be accounted for. This time I have measurements for F123, Starfield, S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, Monster Hunter Wilds, Alan Wake 2, Fortnite, and Red Dead Redemption games. In every case, RX 7600 XT configuration consumes more power, but it also renders more frames, so efficiency ends up to be almost identical. On average, 7600 XT configuration consumes about 350 watts, and that results in 4.56 watts per FPS. Arc B580 configuration consumes about 295 watts of electricity, and that results in a slightly worse efficiency at 4.82 watts per FPS. Intel Arc B580 is not going to save the budget gamers, but at the same time it's also not a complete disaster. Actually, I would prefer B580 over the 8GB alternatives if the price is right. For example, RTX 4060, AMD RX 6650 XT and 7600 come with 8GB of video memory only. The biggest problem for the Arc B580 is probably the second-hand market. Here, very often you can find AMD RX 6700 with 10GB of video memory and 6700 XT with 12GB of video memory for a rather good price. Both of these graphics cards have enough video memory and would perform significantly better with a low-end gaming CPU. So if you don't mind second-hand market and you have a possibility to buy 6700 or 6700 XT for about the same price as B580, I would go with 6700 or 6700 XT. At the same time, if you need a new graphics card or your second-hand market is not as rich as in Sweden, then B580 is a viable alternative. With this being said, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. If this video is gonna be popular, I will try to retest B580 at 1440p and see how it compares to RX 7600 XT. But for now, that's all I have, so see you in the next videos, bye for now.